It's been a while, but now it's back. Range Review World Eaters, let's go! How do you not start with Angron? With World Eaters? Like, surely you gotta start with Angron. I mean, I guess you could start with Kharn. Kharn would also work, but we have the option of a giant demonic monstrosity that used to be a Primarch-shaped monstrosity, and I still think that they did a really good job with this. I still think that Angron really looks the part. He is incredibly, imposing. The armour looks great, that kind of brassy finish that they've gone for in the official paint scheme works really well, but the overall shape of the armour still feels quite, gladiatorial, I guess. The massive sigil above his head, that's not that dissimilar to what Abaddon has, I don't actually think that I would put that on myself. I think I would probably leave that off, because I don't know that he needs that extra height just above his nails encrusted skull, but it doesn't necessarily take anything away either, and he's just such an absolute monster that, I don't know, I think if anyone deserves to have a few skulls on spikes near them, it's gotta be him, right? Size-wise, I think they've pretty much nailed it as well, although maybe would have preferred him to be a little bit bigger. I don't know, I feel like Angron could just be as big as they wanted him to be, and it would just fit because it's Angron, and really, I know there's nothing to support this, but I just feel like he should be as big as he is angry, and that probably doesn't make any sense logically, but then again, does it matter? His face is absolutely horrific. I do like the cables and nails coming out of the head, even though he's been, massively mutated and changed at this point. Things like the big long tail with the massive spiky horn bits coming out of them. Also little details, like if you look at the leg, there's still, cables coming from his leg and attaching to the armour plating of his armour. I like that little detail. It also kind of makes it feel like there's still quite a bit of Primarch left in him, even though he is swollen and red and full of demonic essence. There's still quite a bit of Primarch left, just not enough to combat all of this absolute nightmare material. The pose on the wings is really nice as well. Nice. I like the fact that it's raised, properly raised up. It doesn't actually look like he's about to use them. It looks like he's just waiting, searching for the next person that he is going to hack to pieces, using two weapons that are bigger than most of the things that you can field in the game. That's fantastic. Little details like those wings also having the ports as well that Space Marines and Primarchs have to interface with their power armor. The existence of those ports almost suggests to me that effectively a second pair of arms was forced to grow from the body and then turned into wings in the growth process. I think there is a little bit going on that kind of maybe supports that slightly. When you look at the actual structure of it, it looks like there is a kind of bicep structure going on there that kind of moves down into forearm. And the existence of those ports and the cables coming through, Angron the Primarch did not have four arms. But if the mutation, the easiest way for him to gain those wings when becoming a Demon Prince was to basically take a pair of limbs and copy them and then mutate them, then, it kind of looks like that's what's happened. It's just a bit of headcanon, it's just a theory, it could turn out to be absolutely nothing like that, but that's the impression I've always got looking at him, and I really like it. It is pretty much overall a 10 out of 10 model, and they did a great job with this one. Obviously, we can't look at World Eaters HQs and notable characters without looking at Kharn the Betrayer, who has admittedly aged a little bit now, although this of course is not the oldest model that he's ever had, but he still looks grand. He's an icon. Kharn was just an absolute bro, got on so well with Argyle, they had a wonderful friendship, and then of course everything went horribly wrong, and now he is a rampaging, murderous psychopath who destroys the shelters of his own men to make them fight in the freezing cold, and that's why we love him. That's why we like Kharn. I feel like maybe the chains are a bit overdone on the one arm now. I'm not sure about those anymore. I used to quite like them, but I feel like they're a little bit over the top. But then again, he's Khorn. Skulls and chains and sort of brass-edged armour is the whole deal, so I don't know if that's a legitimate complaint or not. But again, it's one of those things where it maybe muddies the silhouette just a little bit, and it would make it easier to focus on the axe if the long chains weren't there. Overall though, he looks grand. The helmet looks fantastic. I still love the tassels that hang down underneath the creepy mouths. The skulls acting as vents for the power pack always looks fantastic. The axe is really nicely done. And the fact that he still has that one bare arm whilst the other one is still covered in armour is just such a nice little character detail. He is quite busy, but a lot of that busyness has movement behind him. He looks like he's carrying quite a lot of momentum. It's a good pose. It's in action, but it's not too flamboyant. It just looks like he's running towards the next person to kill, which is exactly on brand for what and who Kharn is. The Lord Invocatus has got one of the best helmets for the World Eaters, in my opinion. I absolutely love it. It's this weird mix of organic and mechanical. It looks like it started out as a sarin pattern helm, but it seems to have a furrowed brow, and those horns have just risen and grown out of it. The mouth has gone from being like a grill or a rebreather to it looks like actual teeth. It's very, very creepy and it works super, super well. It's obviously really nice to see Juggernauts back as well. Just having a Juggernaut, love the fact that there's a Juggernaut. The fact that Juggernaut has a chain sword for a horn is extremely extra, but I'm actually okay with it. The only thing that, it's not really a criticism of this model, but it's something that is spurred on by seeing this model. The only thing that I don't like about this model is that we didn't get more World Eaters riding Juggernauts. That's what I want to see more of, and that's what I wanted to see beforehand, and then we were shown this, and I just really wanted to see more of them. Maybe that's something that might be expanded into later down the line. I would absolutely love it if it was, because it just looks right, doesn't it? It just looks right. I also really like the fact that the Invocatus isn't sat down on the saddle. It looks like they're kind of being thrown about a little bit, and so there's a bit of jostling going on. It sells the idea of movement quite well. I don't necessarily like the rock on the base. It looks like it's there to kind of support one of the feet of the Juggernaut, which, to be fair, with that pose, I can kind of see why they'd want to do that, especially given that you've only got 1 foot flat on the ground. It's a nice bit of kind of illusion. It's a nice bit of trickery, but it does make it look a little clunky in some ways. And just given how nicely done this whole model is, it just confuses the eyeline a little bit. It looks a little bit too much like it's tripping over the rock as opposed to jumping over the rock from certain angles. But then from other angles like that, you get the distinct impression that something is going to be catching up with you very quickly and you're going to be in a lot of trouble when it actually does. This angle also really nicely shows off the patterning on the armour, which looks great. Overall, it's super solid. I really liked it when I first saw it, and that has not gone away. I really enjoy this model a lot. On a similar note, the Lord on Juggernaut does also look pretty decent, but just not as good as the named version. Although I will say I do like the pose on the Juggernaut here that little bit better, and it occurs to me that you could probably just do that pose of the Juggernaut, right? You should be able to swap the heads over to get the nice chainsword horn. And apart from that, it's just reposing the legs into whatever you do for this one, and I think I prefer it. The armour obviously still looks good. There's more of it because the Lord doesn't have bare arms with just the gauntlets like the Invocatus does. It still looks decent. It definitely looks good. It's just not quite got the same attitude. It's not quite as in your face. As just a generic Lord goes though, it's hard to have any complaints about this. I also really like the chainsword, the fact that there's that big hilt on it, like the kind of guard over the hand that just seems to be made entirely of metal spikes. That's hardcore. I really like that. There's different armor paneling on the Juggernaut itself as well, which is interesting. This is much more of the sort of classic variety, I think. If I remember rightly, the older Juggernauts had that same kind of armor paneling that had the Khorn symbol as part of the trim, as opposed to being kind of embossed into it. There is definitely a distinct difference between the two Juggernauts themselves, and I really like that a lot. For some reason, this one with the Lord almost looks a bit more bulky around the shoulders, which I don't think is necessarily actually the case, but it kind of feels like it is. I would definitely go for the name version over this one, but it's still a decent looking model. Now, the new Berzerkers, I absolutely love these. Nothing but good things to say about the new Berzerkers. They actually do motion a lot better than the other kit, the older kit they replaced, because Games Workshop got a lot better at depicting like momentum and motion, and the old kit always looked like it was supposed to look like they were moving, but they were in fact just playing musical statues. There was all the things that should make up a good movement in there. You know, a raised leg here, a bit of pitching forwards, a proper run pose. But whilst they all had different poses, they didn't have any momentum to them, which I know is a weird thing to say when it's static models that don't move, but it's giving the illusion of that movement, isn't it? It's making it feel as though these are actually shifting when, of course, they are stuck in one position. And there's different ways of doing it to make that look the case, and I think they've definitely managed it way better here than in the previous kit. I also just love some of the little touches on this kit. Some of the more recent helmets look absolutely fantastic. I do like that there's a really good variety between the helmeted heads and the bear heads. There is also a good amount of variety from one Berserker to the next. I also like the fact there's a lot of variety from one Berserker to the other. Things like some of them having not your standard bit of shoulder armour from normal power armour, but in fact having more cataphracti-esque, curved isn't the right word, but you get what I mean. Also a really nice balance between two-handed weapons and one-handed weapons. The inclusion of a couple of plasma pistols is nice, and it's just such a good remake. It's just such a good update, a good redesign of that older kit. That feeling of movement and momentum is just so much more well defined this time around. Nothing but love for these, to be honest. Absolutely love them. Now, unfortunately, the same can't really be said for the 8-bound and the Exalted 8-bound. I'm still kind of disappointed in these, not least because I don't like the backstory behind these very much. The 8-bound just don't feel right to me. It's like they've just suddenly... When I say they've just suddenly appeared, there's a lot of models that just suddenly appear, and a lot of factions, really, over the years that just suddenly appear. But the idea that each of these is possessed by 8 demons of Khorn, and the demons are so distracted fighting each other that the Khornate warrior can harness the power of them, and that makes them bigger and more brutal is... it's cool, I guess, but we already had Possessed, and... for some reason, for me, kind of going, oh, well, it's like Possessed, but there's 8 of them, and they don't like it, so they're too busy fighting amongst themselves to really do a huge amount to the actual Marine. That doesn't sound like cooler Possessed to me. That just sounds like someone wanted to do Possessed, but didn't know what to do, so they just made it more ridiculous than it already was. And don't get me wrong, I love Possessed. Possessed are fantastic. I still think that I don't know. The newer Possessed are really nicely done because they're a step closer to the Gal Vorbak, which are one of the greatest things that Games Workshop / Forge World have ever made. But these just don't really do it for me for just a myriad of reasons. Chief amongst them, I think, being that they don't look all that different, and the ways in which they do look different don't seem to have any sort of rhyme or reason behind it, or at least it looks like there's a structure to it, but I don't understand why there's a structure to it, I think is the way to put it. When you look at things like the normal Possessed, they've got mutations all over the place, they're an absolute walking mess, right? Because they have been possessed. These have got a strange uniformity to them, where they are also technically possessed, but they all have this same approach of, for some reason, part of the power pack is covered in skin, but it still has an extremely metallic and not grown shape. But you do have things like fangs growing out of it, but for some reason those fangs are metallic in nature, except for the places where they're not, and there are the claws holding the vents, but the actual material connecting the vents to the power pack, even though it is painted as flesh, is distinctly not flesh looking. I guess it feels weird that each of these seems to have a very similar layout for what feels like should be quite a chaotic process, I suppose. And things like that power pack having that kind of flesh coloration, but the rest of the armour doesn't, and it just looks more like a colour it's been painted than anything else, which might be the case, but it's also not consistent with anything else. There is obviously like a bit of a meshing of metal and flesh, and that is part of the possessed as well, and it's part of the Galvorbag too. But in both of those examples, it's so much less standard. It's so much less like there's a template to it. And it could well be that the World Eaters have got this down to a fine art, that when they get a lad possessed by 8 demons, they know exactly how it's going to go and they're able to filter around it. But even that feels kind of contrived to me and just not that cool. The models themselves are okay. They just don't really feel like they represent what's going on in the lore. And when it comes to the models themselves, they are only okay to me because they just look like slightly bigger Berserkers. But the thing is, we've already got Berserkers. We already have a really good example of, you know, Khornate infantry. And we also have a really good example of, in the form of Angron, a demonically infused Khornate warrior. Although in his case, demon prince. But, you know, there's still something to that equivalence when it comes to Angron and the Eightbound, and these don't really live up to either. They just look like a slightly bigger version of one and a much less cool version of the other one. Also, no matter how many times this sentence is said aloud or typed, it will never be true. Eightbound are heretic Astartes possessed by 8 separate demons of Khorn, their swollen forms virtually unrecognisable from the World Eaters they once were. Virtually unrecognisable. If you didn't know that these were once World Eaters, you would just not know that now. You would have absolutely no clue. You wouldn't be able to tell. They're so different, and there's so little going on that's similar that they're virtually unrecognisable. Yeah, no. Now, I'm sure quite a few of you will have been sat there thinking to yourselves, yeah, but all the issues you're describing with the Eightbound are solved with the Exalted Eightbound, and that is kind of true a little bit. Some of the same design choices irk me a bit and don't quite fit. Things like the power packs being the same. It's a dual purpose kit, so they just reuse the same power packs, which still have that element of, well, why is this so perfectly formed and uniform across each one? But there has been something of a more like bigger step towards making them look more demonic. The Exalted Eightbound having formed more of like a perfect union of 8 demons and 1 Chaos Space Marine, thus forming something closer to just the normal possessed that we see, but slightly less cool, with a few exceptions. Things like that guy having a big buzzsaw coming out of his hand, that is undeniably incredibly cool. And I do like the whole teeth sprouting out of the armour thing. That is pretty good. The feet on the main guy in the middle there, they're not doing anything to sell the pose that he has, but overall I do prefer the Exalted ones over the standard Eightbound. But to be honest, I think a big core part of it is that I didn't feel like this army needed more of basically Berserkers but bigger. I didn't feel it needed that, because we already have Berzerkers, and I was kind of hoping for some sort of Terminator-esque thing, something that was maybe a bit slower, maybe had a bit more range, but was still suitable for World Eaters, something that was a bit more implacable and still had a little bit of what they had in like the Horus Heresy. I was kind of hoping for like the Red Butchers or whatever to show up in some capacity, but instead we got less cool possessed, which just doesn't work as well for me, to be honest. I think something that exacerbates things as well is that we also have the Jakhals. Now, the Jakhals are basically the human followers of the World Eaters, and they are pretty much Berserkers, but not as strong because they're not Space Marines, although they do have fun things like vats of blood and the like on their backs to give them a bit of fuel. And it is worth noting that the guy leading this Jakhal squad does have a few power armor ports in his body, which is cool. The reason that this made me less keen on the Eightbound, on top of just the overall concept that I wasn't a big fan of, is that this is yet another thing that does what Berserkers do, and while the World Eaters are very much a charge into the face of the enemy and smash that face open type of army, it still feels a little bit redundant somehow to have basically the same unit 3 times over at varying sizes and costs. Now obviously these are a lot more chaff-like, they haven't got the same strength or save or anything as the Berserkers do, of course, I mean why would they? And, you know, the Eightbound have got their own thing going on, but visually, it leaves it to be a little bit too uniform for me. That all being said, though, this is still a really good-looking squad. Like, issues of things looking a bit samey here and there aside, these are really nicely done. They look absolutely terrifying, horrendous. Just a bunch of absolute psychopaths, shirtless psychopaths for the most part, charging at you with as many chainsword bladed things that they can hold, and it's properly scary. The various masks and rebreathers do nothing to make them look less like apocalyptic psychopaths, and the vats of blood being carried on their backs really speaks to a very unhealthy addiction going on there. They look fantastic, and just because I'm not a particular fan of how the army as a whole came out in terms of there not being all that much in the way of fun variety, I can't help but love the Jakhals anyway. It might just be that the army as a whole isn't particularly for me, in which case that's totally fine, but the individual elements of it, Eightbound aside, I really, really like. The Jakhals are like no exception to that. They look fantastic. I'd love to see these in Necromunda as well. I wonder if they've got rules for that game. I feel like they'd fit pretty well with all the other nutters in that system. Finally, we have got the Lord of Skulls. Now, I believe we already covered this in the Chaos Space Marines range review, but we're going to cover it again because I love it. I had one. It was fantastic. I mean, it was absolutely stupid, incredibly dumb, rubbish design, like just flat out terrible design. It's not good in that it can barely turn. When you look at how far down the axe goes, yeah, you can hit a few things, but it's got no manoeuvrability whatsoever. The chest is locked into facing one specific way, so it's got a massive weak spot at the back. It's also, you just can't pose it. It's just not a thing that you can pose. I did try, and I had a real tough time getting the arms to sit in a way that made sense, given that the elbows are locked into position. So just if you're ever thinking of buying one, where those elbows are, how that is, that's how that is. You can't do anything about that. You have to cut, and I mean, it would be an absolute pain because there's skulls buried in the joint. Overall, stupid, terrible design. Absolutely awful. But, you know what? Amazing. Hilarious, ridiculous, over the top, very, very silly. Might be just one of the silliest things in 40k. And there is a part of me that even whilst I was building mine and turning it into something for Slaanesh instead, obviously, I was like, what am I doing with this kit? Like, what is this? Why did I buy this? Look how stupid it is. But for some reason, it breaks through the barrier, right? It loops. It's so stupid that it made me like it. It's so dumb that it looped all the way back round to activating that little part of your brain that's still like 10 or 11 years old, where you see something that's really over the top and you know full well that it's not actually cool, but at the same time, look at it, it's really cool. I mean, that's the Lord of Skulls. That is the Lord of Skulls, just summed up. It's so stupid, it loops all the way back round to being cool again. I'd suggest just getting one of those Khitan Ravagers instead, but that's Legends now. In terms of this whole range, between everything that is on offer for the World Eaters that we haven't already covered, because of course they do get access to various Chaos Space Marine vehicles as well, which we've already talked about, I have to admit it's between the Berzerkers and Angron. I mean, those two models really, really work for me. They are pretty much perfect in every way, and I think the only... Actually, no. The Invocatus as well. Those three kits alone are absolutely fantastic. They're great, and I love them. When it comes to the Eightbound, if I were to ever start a World Eaters army, I'd be incredibly tempted to just run Possessed Chaos Space Marines instead. I feel like I feel like I would get more enjoyment out of those and would prefer the look a lot more. But you know what? One kit out of the entire force that I'm not particularly a fan of is not bad. It's not bad. They've done a good job with the World Eaters overall, I think. Although really, the range needs to be about 2 times the size. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what your favourite kit of this range is in the comments down below. I'm sure many of you will disagree with the 8-bound stuff. And you know what? That's absolutely fine. We all have our own opinions and our own preferences. And that's totally fine. Thank you very much for watching. And I will see you for the next one.